Well. Welcome back. We are back. I'm Dave. I'm here with Janet, and this is the Book on Fire podcast.
It's high summer here.
It is summertime. The last time that we talked to y'all, it was springtime. And we were talking about how the spring peepers were out, and you could hear the spring peepers in the background. Spring peepers are still here. But now they've been joined by the fireflies, which are starting to fill the hollows and the gardens and little by little even the woods of the land here. But they're nowhere near their peak yet. But hopefully, if we get a rain sometime soon, they are really going to emerge. And today is May 30th. We are taking a break from gardening, medicine making, chopping up firewood, moving it around, teaching herbal medicine at our school, and everything else that we do in full swing right now to have this final-ish conversation devoted to Donna Haraway's book, Staying with the Trouble, which we've been reading since February. Is that right? February?
It's been a long time.
Yeah, it's been a long time. And if you're listening to this, thank you for sticking with us, because we know that these episodes have gotten a little further apart. But I think that I'm really excited about this one, because this has been a really amazing book and a really fun book to read, and really fun book to read with y'all and talk about. And I don't know, it's just our conversations have spun off in a lot of different really interesting and productive directions. So today we are just going to have final thoughts, kind of. I mean, final is the wrong word, but kind of wrap up conversation about some of the highlights of the book, maybe. And then also just kind of where we want to take it, where we want to take this book to, how we would like to extend the ideas in the book, right? Mm-hmm. And thanks to folks who have written in or commented in any way, it's informed what we're going to say today. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, maybe we should just get into it. So this book is it's been 8 chapters, which really only totaled, I think 167 pages, something. It's one of those books that has almost as many pages of endnotes as it does text. Mm-hmm. Some of the chapters were quite short. Some of them are very, very memorable. I think the Tentacular Thinking, the Sympoiesis chapters were really big for me. How about you?
The book is packed with information and things to think about, and I actually am looking forward to listening to the discussions again, so I can revisit some of the thoughts I was having along the way, and some of the ground we went to, because I feel like there's, I can't even remember all of the thoughts I had at this point.
So you're going to subscribe maybe to the podcast?
I might subscribe to the podcast.
Maybe you can rate us on iTunes.
I'm not... Does it matter if I'm not on iTunes?
Okay. Someone else should do that, maybe.
I don't know, I was just thinking about how it felt like a big chunk of my mind for the past few months has been devoted somewhat to this on and off, but now that I've gotten really busy in the summertime, I had to just be reminded of where all we've gone.
Yeah.
Which is why this might be more of a winter type podcast for us. Mm-hmm. But, going back through the chapters, I revisited the Sympoiesis chapter and reread the comic about the bee orchid and the orchid who has lost its mutualism and lost its pollinator, and was just once again really moved by that. And it's nice because there's it rounds off in the communal stories with a story of someone who loses their mutualism character or a lineage of characters who lose their connection to their species, other than human species that they share a lifeway with. So, I don't know, I've definitely been revisiting the concept of collective grief and individual grief, and how we will be able to face that and make space for it in their life now and our life as all of us move on, which I'm not maybe really ready to go into any depth right now, but I was just remembering that and being glad that was tied together, because there's some loose ends in the books or threads that are not picked back up and woven back in, but the grief part does feel like it comes back.
Yeah, she does. I liked the way that it really ends with that. The whole book ends with that.
It really does.
There's a lot of inspirational models that she's tried to fill the book with for ways that we can make these really potent, vital, transformative connections towards multi-species flourishing and all of these goals. And there can be like a giddy almost. I mean, the book is full of the challenges, but there can be like kind of a giddiness to like the string figures and theorizing these multi-species connectivity. But it definitely, I like the reminder at the end that like, oh, the future will be a time of grief.
Yeah. And the present.
I mean, just like now, where, like these bad feelings aren't just going to go away, and there's going to be a lot more to grieve. No matter how good we do,
What chapters stand out for you when you think back on the book?
Or
parts.
What stands out for me? In the very first chapter, the string figures, because the first chapter is called Playing String Figures with Companion Species, and the actual concept of the string figures. I'm kind of an ontology nerd, and so the figure of the string figure with its knots, like the Jacob's ladder or like the cat's cradle figure, as an image of the way that connectivity between life forms and species and stuff happens in nature that can be like reconfigured and then passed on, and all of that stuff was it made a big imprint on me. I also really loved the involutionary momentum paper that was referenced, which I went out and read too on my own. So that was kind of a line that I followed out of the book into something that she referenced, which had to do with the concept of involution as a complement to evolution, where evolution, as in the evolution of species, has to do with things diverging from one another, where involution has to do with species coming together and forming relationships and forming assemblages. Not like merging genetically, but forming relationships like the bee and the orchid and stuff. That was really big for me. And then I think like in that same chapter, the Sympoiesis chapter, the final example of science art worldings, which is the Navajo churro sheep,
right. Yeah.
And everything going on around Dene, Hopi history, fossil fuel extraction, colonization, genocide, extermination of the sheep, and then the resurgence of the churro sheep within this matrix of anti-fossil fuel extraction activism,
right,
and indigenous lifeways resurgence, and all of this stuff was like a very, very powerful, of all of the like concrete examples of things that Haraway sees happening on the ground, that she holds out as at least partial embodiments of the kinds of principles that she's highlighting and promoting with the book. That one did a lot for me.
Yeah.
It was really powerful.
It feels really concrete.
Very concrete, and also just very wide-ranging.
Yeah.
Where it's not only an example of multi-species partnership, because it's humans and sheep at least, but it's also partnership among different humans with different backgrounds. So it's like Navajo people, Hopi people, sheep fancier, like herder people. This is not sheep fanciers. We've talked about pigeon fanciers on the podcast before. Sheep fanciers maybe is not a thing, but
it might be a thing, but it has a different connotation.
Yeah. Is fancier the word for that? The
sheep tenders.
Yeah, but then also, it's the intersection of indigenous resurgence with direct action against extractive economies,
right? Climate
change and fossil fuels. There's just so many intersections.
Yeah,
that's what makes it powerful.
It has the art component, but it's not like art as an end result. There's art in there, which is the blankets and the weaving, which is functional art, but it's still art. But it is not art in and of itself with a goal for drawing attention to the issue.
Right.
Which a lot of the examples feel like that to me.
Right.
They're more conceptual art as...
Right, like the coral reef.
Or the coral reef,
crochet.
some of the pigeon, but I feel like there's something very different around the big conglomeration of folks and organizations that are working together to support Navajo folks in their own work.
Yeah.
To restore this tradition, restore relationship with the sheep, and to fight fossil fuel extraction and its impact on their communities. It feels different to me. It doesn't feel like art doing a job.
Yeah.
The art is just like part of all of the... It's woven in with the rest of the material there.
Yeah. Yeah. So those are some highlights of the book for me.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's more, but that's what I can think of right now.
So I know that we've had some things come up for us again throughout the podcast or the discussion of the book of just like parts that we feel like are maybe missing or what would we like to see added to this or to put it in a more positive way, like how would we extend what is in the book?
Yeah, that's been a question for me, is like how taking what the book is doing really well and the ground that it's covering, how does this fit in to everything else that we're trying to do? Because it's a book of a lot of syntheses, so it's bringing in a lot of stuff, but it still doesn't pretend to answer all the questions or to tell us everything we need to know, to move forward. We're already moving. This book can inform some of what we can do. And so how do we incorporate it? How do we, and like Janet's saying, how do we extend the insights in the book in ways that plug in to the challenges we're facing, the struggles that we're undertaking? So one thing that I kept thinking about, especially in the initial chapters of the book, which feels like where more of sort of the philosophical groundwork for the book is getting laid, was where is the vitalism in this text? And what I mean by asking that is there's I don't know, what would you call it? A philosophy, a practical approach to life that I have.
And an observation.
Yeah, that's based on observation.
Right.
That I've come to, and Janet shares this. Our School of Herbal Medicine is explicitly vitalist. The blog that we write is called Radical Vitalism. This is something that permeates, it's a concept that permeates a lot of what we do. So, but maybe y'all don't know about this. It has to do with, basically, I mean, it has a lot of implications, and it has a lot of implications for like working with people's health and everything. But it basically, the fundamental insight of vitalism is that nature, with all of the problematicness of that word possibly, but nature, uninhibited, knows how to create life, to create complexity, and to heal from damage. Right? And when life is not healing well, it's usually because there's obstacles to that.
Right.
Something is keeping it from healing, or it's lacking in some variety of nourishment. It's lacking in some like basic fuel or nutrition or something, and we can consider that broadly, depending on what kind of living system, whether it's a community or like a human community or a plant community or a human organism or something, lacking in some kind of resource that it needs to have vitality, right? So part of the insight that comes from vitalism is that like nature, whatever this is, like an ecosystem, the planet, our bodies have an innate ability to live, grow, mature, create complexity, and that also means bouncing back from harm and damage, And so part of what vitalism does is it resists the kind of like heroic urge in medicine, because we articulate vitalism in a holistic healing context, that kind of assumes that like the doctor or the medical system is going to like go in there and perform the healing intervention, is going to like fix the body the way that a mechanic fixes a car, but a car is not like a living system that has its own healing impulse, like a body is. And so vitalism says, yeah, there's lots of interventions to be made, and like we as herbalists or doctors or whoever facilitate healing, but let's acknowledge that there's an innate healing drive and power that exists in every body, every ecosystem, the planet, all this stuff. And so where those thoughts come into play when reading this book is where I just don't feel the vitalist observation reflected in the way that Haraway or her colleagues like Anna Tsing talk about the like recuperation and recuperation in the sense of like a sick person getting better that needs to happen. The recuperation that needs to happen. I see a lot of Haraway talking about like we need to make these intentional connections and we need to like be experimental about participating in ecosystems and with other forms of life in these like novel assemblages that can create finite flourishing, to use her language. And it's all great. I mean, I love it. And also I think that it's missing this baseline that says connections happen and healing occurs through connection a lot of times when the forces that impede it are removed or undermined, and there's enough resources to fuel those connections happening. It's just like, like you can clear cut some of this southern Appalachian forest and organisms will come in, plants will grow, shrubs will grow, they might make berries that'll attract birds, the birds will make droppings that fertilize the soil. These are like well-studied processes of healing that happens without any human intervention coming in. The humans just do the harm by clear cutting. And then the other organisms come in and heal the land and build the soil back up and retain nutrients and all of this stuff. And just that fundamental insight that healing happens without us having to do it necessarily any kind of like novel experimentation
is missing.
Is kind of missing, and I'm really excited about all of that experimentation. People out there doing like mycoremediation with mushrooms and like doing, like all of this stuff. It's like, I'm not saying we don't need to do that, but I would add to what's going on in this book an appreciation for vital healing as a baseline process of nature. Do you have anything to comment on that?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, it's interesting that you came up with a clear-cut forest metaphor because I kept thinking while you were talking about, I feel like what you're pointing to is the human tendency to think that we are necessary for systems to heal.
Yes.
That we are part of.
Yeah.
And I would argue that we are in the sense that we are part of systems that are the obstacles to healing and that those obstacles need to be removed.
Yes.
But I would say that our tendency to...
It's not the way she's talking about
identify ourselves as crucial to the healing feels like a form of hubris, which she points to other places.
Yeah.
But it can also be kind of ham-fisted and misguided if we don't have some sort of awareness around connection and how things work already. And my example of that I was thinking of is, I think it was last year, maybe it was the fall before that, actually. No, it was 2 falls ago. There was a ton of fire in the Pacific Northwest in the Columbia River Gorge.
Yeah.
Like a lot of fire. After a century or more of fire suppression, right?
Right.
So fire is part of the natural cycle there, and fire is important for that ecology. And fire has been suppressed for a long time, and it's affecting trees up and down and systems up and down the West Coast.
Yeah.
This fire suppression.
Right.
People were freaking out because the places that humans were freaking out, but because of the places that they like to go hiking and stuff were on fire. It was really hard.
Because of this kid who set off some fireworks.
Right.
Right.
However, post-fire,
right.
You had some people being like, cool, maybe this is going to put us back into balance a little bit, even though that was a lot. There were also a lot of people being like, all right, you guys, let's get out there. We're going to meet up. Let's go plant some trees. We're going to, like, get this going. And meanwhile, the people who actually are more familiar with the system and the importance of fire there was like, you planting trees might actually be destructive in this situation because the forest has its own response to fire.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, because people were doing GoFundMes to buy seedlings and stuff, and it was like, right. I remember some of these conversations.
It was as if the forest wasn't prepared for this.
Yeah.
And didn't have a way to move forward on its own without well-meaning humans from Portland going out and planting trees.
Yeah, right.
And so, to be fair, I mean, I was aware of all this because of friends in Portland and other places in the Pacific Northwest who were criticizing this idea and urge to fix things.
Right, because we don't live in an ecology that is so dependent on fire.
No, not at all. And so this is not something I would have come up with on my own. I just like watched the dialogue happening and thinking about it. But I feel like if we're not careful, we can be these tree planters interfering with a system who already has a plan or has a way to heal itself and move forward. So that's one thought I have. I just wanted to say as an aside that I actually think Anna Singh understands vitalism, but it is more important in her work outside of this. Okay. She doesn't actually talk about vitalism as she's quoted here or in her other text, but I don't
need people to say the word.
But in The Mushroom at the End of the World, she does talk about the emergent life and vitality and exciting ways of being and connection that erupt almost in the way that a fungal fruiting buddy would in the in the network and multi-species connections that follow the Matsutakis. Right. So anyway, I just want to say that I don't think that she is averse to that way of thinking.
So maybe like in Mushroom at the End of the World, the things that she's documenting, like the cultural things, the mushroom distribution thing. I haven't read the book, but all of the things that she's documenting, the relationships that are forming between the mushrooms and these humans and stuff could be interpreted as potentially vital healing in action.
I think so, and I would even say that the Matsutake
itself... That is what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
it's
right.
Like, those things happening are the larger planetary ecosystems, like, trying to heal themselves.
Right. And the Matsutake itself, in the places where they come up in great abundance, where there are camps and people harvesting them, because there's so many of them, are often disturbed landscapes, according to her.
Right.
Where, when there's actually, like, tonnage of them. They are often in places that are disrupted and in transition. And so I think she sees the mushrooms themselves as part of the healing process that is inherent in the system. And the people connecting into that are part of that healing as well. So I do think she actually has a more vitalist approach, whether or not she's saying that.
Right. Yeah. Well, thanks for that. I mean, yeah, and that helps me see the light in... You know, this thing that I'm pointing out that I'm like, is it lacking? I'm not sure. You know, because it's not like there's no room for it in what Haraway is saying. I just think I'm just always trying to add that into conversations. Sure. I'm just trying to add that into frameworks, you know, because I also want to undermining the, like, we need, you know, the sort of humans as saviors too. That says, like, we need to strap cell phone transmitters on the backs of pigeons in order to move this problem forward into a healing direction. The solutions are going to come from these innovative art science worlding experimenters who are going to, like, think outside the box and create these, like, odd connections that are going to end up having a healing influence, or else there's going to be just greater degradation, you know? And I mean, I think that definitely humans need to act. Obviously, humans need to act to the extent that it's human-controlled forces that are the obstacles to healing.
Right.
You know? You know? So that's like a reframing. That's like that's a framing that I would add on to what is going on in this book. Is that, you know, nature knows how to heal, knows how to create abundant, diverse, amazing, jaw-dropping life and and symbiotic, connections of life in these ecosystems of codependency out of a planet of just water and rocks, that all happened. And that all...
And it might happen again.
Might happen again, It's not so, for me, it's not so much that we need to form these symbiotic connections so that the world can heal, although I'm into those too, but also we need to act against the forces that discourage those connections from happening, and keep them from happening. So, it's not, I just want to make clear that I'm not saying like, hey, the earth can heal. Like, we don't need to we don't need to be like all heroic and like active about it or something. It's not on us. Like, forget about it or whatever. That's not my point. Hopefully y'all understood that that's not my point. My point isn't that we need to do less or something because nature can heal. It's that I think when we talk about that, we need to undermine our own heroic impulses and to acknowledge that nature doesn't need us to be its doctor.
Right.
Which brings us to another thing that we wanted to add on to what's going on with this book.
Yeah. So, sometimes when reading this book, it was easy for me to feel like what was happening is just a conundrum we all suddenly woke up and found ourselves in. And that we need to figure a way out of.
Right.
And it doesn't feel very grounded in history. The disaster of history.
Yeah.
If I thought about it in more of a Benjamin type way.
Yeah.
And doesn't seem to be in a line. Well, I guess what I would say is it feels like it's lacking some analysis on the fact that there are forces, both individuals and organizations, and even just forces bigger than that, that are deeply invested in us continuing on this suicidal path that we're on. And not only suicidal, ecocidal, which is more important.
Yep.
And so where is that critique of the powers that be? And can we even talk about all of this and strategize without confronting power and talking about power in that way?
Right.
And as an aside to that, I would also say that there's a time that it even feels like there's a conflation of power to with power over, and that we should maybe even be avoiding gaining power because we will likely abuse it. So there's a lot in there, and I don't know which part we want to pick up, but I will just say that, I am often thinking this isn't happening in a vacuum.
Right.
There are a lot of forces keeping things the way they are.
Yeah.
And that are keeping people from even having time and energy to consider doing differently.
Right. Right. I'm with you on that. I do feel like that the book, she doesn't engage much with what would limit or resist the kind of work that the book is trying to uplift.
Right.
And definitely doesn't go to the next step, which would be, how can we persist and resist in the face of what would oppose us in doing this work? So this is definitely some of what we want to talk about too. Cause even in Haraway's domain, which is the university, and she doesn't only uplift scientists, but she uplifts a lot of scientists or people who are academically trained who are doing these kind of creative outside the box work that she talks about. But university funding is getting cut. The grants and the funding that...
Especially if they pertain to climate change.
Especially if they pertain to climate change.
Yeah.
And especially if they don't feed directly into the economy.
Right.
Making the economy work harder.
Hooray.
And so, that, just even from her perspective, as I'm trying to put myself in her place more, even just from her perspective, she's like, let's have more of this type of science, art stuff or whatever. But then the world where that stuff is incubated and nurtured is like changing really fast.
We're going to have to crowdsource all these art science worldings.
Yeah, so that's going to be, it's going to be on Kickstarter instead. Funded by more and more economically precarious and cash-strapped individuals, so, to fund this stuff instead,
or having to make more and more compromise while you let corporations pay for your thing so they look better.
Yeah, right. So there's all kinds of limitations that you could see. That's just one. I mean, the thing about university funding is just one little, kind of intersection here, but obviously the capitalists are doubling down on their needs as there's fewer resources in the system and stuff is going into crisis. And they are doubling down. I mean, that's why we have the president that we do in the United States right now who's like, deregulate everything, like no oversight, like more profit to all the companies. They are doubling down and trying to just still make the bucks as easy as they can while the system, sustains them for a few more years or something. Anyway, we don't have to do a whole diagnosis of all of the forces that are opposing this kind of work, but there are forces opposing this kind of work.
And as the economy becomes less and less feasible in the face of limits to growth.
Yeah.
The squeeze is being put on workers more and more, and on cash poor folks more and more, and people of means, maybe working like 5 jobs.
Yeah.
And so we are keeping like more and more intensely distracted just through the basic survival cost to our lives and time and energy and money.
Right.
And it's hard to think outside of that, to think of the scope, the level of awareness, and how many things we have to hold at one time so we can even consider what we're facing globally is hard to hold at the same time as it is just trying to make ends meet.
In the absence of an analysis of power,
right?
Because the book does not have a very strong analysis of power, although it acknowledges all kinds of like colonization and patriarchy and it acknowledges a lot of forms of power, including capitalism, that are held over people. It's not grounded in an analysis of power. It's weird. Right. But in the absence of an analysis of power, one way that the book could be taken, I don't think she means it this way, but one way it could be taken, and we've talked about this in a previous podcast, but is like, let's push this way of thinking, symbiotic, tentacular, everything, into the way that the world is managed.
Right.
Like, push it upward. Like, advocate for it. And that's just I'm not here for that.
Right.
I'm not here for let's write and educate and lobby and try and get the management and the governance of the world to incorporate
tentacular thinking.
Right.
You're like, let's get rid of the managers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I don't think that's the vision that Haraway's putting forward. Really.
She just doesn't go to great pains to exclude that vision.
Right. It's true. Yeah. Right. Right. So we need to add on to this book, I think, an analysis of power, which is relevant in more than one way, right? This is just going back over stuff that we just talked about, but it's relevant in assessing where we're going to meet resistance, where we're going to meet obstacles, right? And that's the thing, is like, if you start practicing in this way, then, see, and this is where a really fruitful conversation could happen. And I really want to have this conversation, but we're just going to suggest it here. But it's like, if you start practicing in this way and you're like, all right, direct action, let's put these ideas on the ground. Again, the Navajo Churro sheep is like my favorite example in the book. Not that they were like, we're going to do what Haraway says, but she picked it out as an example of some ways of practicing that she likes. What are the possibilities? you have success up to a point, and then you meet resistance where the system's not going to budge. Or some of what you're bringing gets recuperated or incorporated into the system in some way as like a reform or a modification, you know? Or there's this like tantalizing but vague third possibility, which is that by dint of multiple pressure at multiple points, that a transformation occurs. You know?
Which may end up with an outcome or future we can't even imagine.
Right. Yeah. Which is like, so that means it's hard to strategize for.
Right.
But especially in the context of an empire that is already in decline.
Right.
And a capitalist system that is in decline and is going to be facing ruptures and schisms and the possible loss of control over its parts already, then there's cracks opening where we can exert force and sort of try and catalyze some of these transformations, you know?
Right.
And that's, I think, that's a very different vision than like, we need to seize power.
Right.
In like an old school, like Marxist sense, or like a Leninist sense, let's say, of the people need to like seize the state. Or seize power in some way, and then wield power in the name of the people. I mean, you know, I'm not that interested in that kind of revolution either.
Right.
And I think, and I'm with Haraway, where she's like, be suspicious of that. That might be your prick tail coming up. Okay, so as long as we're talking about the prick tail, I would like to get a little bit more specific as a final wrap-up conversation here and summarize sort of my take on this conversation that's happening in and around Haraway's book around different visions for change, different forms of storytelling towards change, and how that relates to power, basically. And all of this kind of, the prick tail, as has come up in the previous chapters, is kind of a emblematic element of all of this, right? Let's set the stage, okay? So when it comes to working towards change and working towards liberation, there are a lot of different strategies and stances that people take towards that, okay? And one of them that's just kind of a perennial thing, it's always out there, you know, at least going back to Marx's theories of the revolutionary proletariat and all of that, is that almost like no matter how oppression is being carried out in the given moment, the most important work is always simply, which I say in quotes because it's not that simple, to just get enough people into the streets, basically, so that the system is massively disrupted and that power is overthrown, that the state is overthrown.
Right.
After which we can make the society that we want to live in. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, you know this. That, like, no matter how we diagnose the various intersecting problems of the state that we're in, that, like, that is still the solution.
Right.
You know? And that's one image of the revolution, right? You know, in the Marxist sense, traditionally, like, it would be like organizing the workers, right? Organizing the working class. Nowadays, it might look a little bit different, but it's still, like, basically, the goal is to get enough people to put down reproducing business as usual, to leave the reproduction of misery, enter, you know, the streets, like, basically is kind of like the archetypal site of this, you know, and raise hell until the system collapses, right? That our work is to muster the energy and the numbers and whatever it is to break through to the better place, to break out of the trap that we're in into whatever post-revolutionary possibility we've been dreaming of. And, of course, that's super oversimplified because how to get all those people into the streets is a matter for current tactics and all of that. And then how the system after, like how the new world after the revolution would be constructed is like something people spend a lot of time thinking about. But still, like the fulcrum point, the thing that we should be putting all of our energy into is that uprising, So with that image of the revolution as kind of a very time-honored, but also kind of crusty and like,
well, and the limitations have become obvious as groups of power, groups of individuals or organizations have seized power in similar ways or even more problematic ways than the power they were overthrowing.
Right. And historical example, because there have been revolutions of that type that were limited, to a particular country or something that resulted in equally oppressive governments.
Right.
That gets to the question of, do you seize the state while keeping the state intact? Mm-hmm. Or do you dismantle the state? That's a whole argument that's been going on forever. But we have this as sort of the default idea. And it's still a lot of people's baseline idea. And part of what I hear Haraway saying with this book, because she's familiar with that idea, and not just her, but Stengers and her allies and the people who she calls into this book, is there's nowhere to break through to. There's nowhere to break out to. There's this. And that's what Staying with the Trouble is kind of about, is that we move into the future building off of what's already here, making new connections with the elements that are already in place. And it feels to me that the spirit of this book is very much in resistance to this kind of transcendent or transcendental idea or whatever, that a moment of delirious rupture will free us from the present and transport us into a new reality. And, Haraway's saying, part of what she's bringing in is that, like, climate change is like the cat's out of the bag. No matter what happens politically, humans have unleashed this thing that's going to continue to run a destructive course for generations.
At least.
And then also, there's more of an ideological thing that's happening too, which is that maybe this emphasis on breaking out, breaking free, neglecting the complexities of the present, and instead just constituting the present as the thing to be left behind, is destructive in itself.
Well, because there's also this like way that it's like we're waiting for the next thing instead of acting.
Right.
We're waiting for a messianic moment of some kind.
Right. Yeah. Where like anything that you would do to marginally increase flourishing in the present that's not the revolution, or that's not actively trying to trigger the revolution or facilitate it in some way, could be written off by revolutionaries as a reformist measure, something that's just trying to make the intolerable present a little less hard. When really, the present is just intolerable because it's constituted on all of these fucked up premises. And it simply just needs to be trashed. I understand this tension. I understand wanting to not just tinker with the present in the hopes of making it a little more bearable, and wanting to actually make a big break and overthrow our oppressors. And I also understand, and appreciate everything that Haraway and her allies and her ilk and everybody who's bringing a similar critique in a different way and using different language, which is that what we're doing now prefigures the world that could be after the revolution, or what we're doing now is maybe creating the world that we want. And there might not be a big moment where things suddenly change in just the space of 2 or 3 short years. And that waiting on that, or just putting all our energy into making that happen, neglects a lot of work that we can and should be doing, and that would actually be transformative if we had a different model for what transformation could look like, what could create transformation, you know? And then also there's what you might call the feminist analysis that's layered in there too, which is the pricktail versus the carrier bag.
Right.
Where the revolution, like I've talked about here, is more of a pricktail story. You know? It's more of, there might not be like a masculine hero that like leads the revolution, but it's still the heroic sort of muscular, courageous activity of the uprising proletarians to make a clean break. You know, she even, when she talks about the pricktail, it's like the sword, the thing that cuts, to make a clean break, to like turn the world upside down and all of this stuff, you know, because like Marduk, who's like an archetypal pricktail character from Mesopotamian mythology, like just remakes the world through his like heroic act against chaos and everything.
I was just thinking too that like a lot of times we don't bring up the pen, and she brings up the pen as also part of the pricktail, and in that situation I don't think she just means writing, but what she means is like ideology.
Yeah.
And I wanted to bring ideology up in here to say, like, having looked at the historical examples of this, when there is an ideology that does the thinking for people, then we don't have very good outcomes. So I just wanted to throw ideology into this as we're listing off the tools.
And what can be opposed to ideology, the word, the pen, the sword, is what she talks about, the carrier bag, which is gathering and collecting, you know. And you gather and collect partially from the elements of the present, because it's not that we don't want anything that's here now, you know, and collecting, composting, gathering, and assembling what we have access to into a livable world is also transformational and revolutionary. So anyway, this is kind of the opposition. I've been helped in processing the book and what's going on with it by thinking of this kind of opposition, putting all your energy into the transcending revolutionary moment on one hand versus what Haraway's saying, which is, it's just this. Let's just stay with the trouble, pay attention, make connections, make alliances, and through these actions, we can build slowly, non-innocently, but ultimately very powerfully and responsibly the future flourishing by acknowledging the connections that we are a part of and extending those connections in novel ways, remembering what's been dismembered and trying new things. And that will be what actually sustains us. That will be the struggle, kind of, you know, which I find to be very powerful, really powerful idea. So then, out of this opposition, has us thinking about there's a third way, what I'm calling a third way, that I feel like could be elucidated out of the tension between the opposition to these two frameworks. And it comes out of, you know, the sort of the pretext for wanting or feeling like we need this third way is everything that we've kind of talked about already on the podcast today so far, which is just that, like, where's the acknowledgement that this sympoietic connecting practice is going to run up against limitations, is going to run up against opposition.
And violent repression.
And possibly violent repression. And yeah, like about how there's not strategizing in the book about how to defend ourselves, outmaneuver, protect ourselves from, and to resist, you know, the forces that don't want us to do this work. But for me, like, to think in the ways that Haraway is teaching us to think, it naturally follows, that thinking naturally follows into strategic thinking that involves sustaining our struggles and undermining our enemies. Like, that's just part of where my thinking automatically goes. Like, for instance, here's an example, right? Okay, so I'm into permaculture, and I study permaculture, and we practice it here on the land, right? Which is just, permaculture is just an easy word to point towards, like, applied ecology. The art and science and practices of humans trying to integrate themselves into ecology in a way that's beneficial for the humans and for the ecology. And it's very much in line with what Staying with the Trouble is all about. And part of what goes along with the permaculture idea is that if we think ecologically by the way that we try to manage the systems that sustain us and like grow our food and grow our medicine and stuff, then we will benefit. We won't have to maybe work as hard because we are going with the flow of nature instead of going against it. You know, by having to plow the field all the time and use fossil fuels and tractors to do it, and then destroying the soil and then replacing the fertility with chemical fertilizers and all this type of stuff, right? So, but one could think like, okay, if we employ these practices, if we create these more ecological habitats for us to live in, then we will become healthier, more ecologically literate, more enmeshed in the web of life, and able to draw sustenance and power from that, more autonomous and resilient in the context of capitalism, where if you're producing more of what you need for your home just right around you, in your neighborhood and locally, then you don't have to go to the store as much, you don't have to buy things as much, so you're less dependent on cash, you're less dependent on money, you know. And, you know, if you collect rainwater or whatever, then you're more resilient against water outages, you know, just all of this stuff, right? And so that greater resilience and that greater autonomy and that greater skill building puts us in a better position to struggle, puts us in a better position to fight against the forces that oppress us, against capitalism and the state, because we are less dependent on them. And we're also more sustained in our struggles by what we can reap. Instead of just reaping through earning money at jobs and in capitalism. We actually reap from ecological systems that we're a part of. You know? And that greater autonomy gives us more wiggle room and more space to actually like take risks, apply pressure to the pressure points of the system to try to force transformations to happen. So that kind of thing is a really natural train of thought for me to follow. And not just me. I mean, there's lots of us who are like, yes, 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 and connecting the dots in these ways. And just one thing that I've noticed in Haraway's book is that she stops at a certain point along that train of association, where it's like, form the connections, weave yourself into ecologies. But how those methods can be like wielded in our favor as power building is not something that she seems very excited to talk about.
I think it's because she conflates power with the revolution story, which is what I was saying earlier.
Yeah.
I don't think that she always considers power building as building networks of food and self-reliance and mutual aid and creating alternative systems to the systems that are extractive as a form of building power. Or maybe she just doesn't want to talk about power. I don't know.
Right. I'm not sure what's going on, but this is something that I would like to add to the book, is the idea that to be inspired by this book and to follow what it's gesturing towards and to go in that direction also could and should maybe put us in a better position against our opponents. And that can be a way to guide us in the work as well. Is not just by doing these things just for the sake of doing them, but doing them with a mind and a perception towards, does this increase our power? Power in that sense as just the capacity of communities to provide for themselves and resist the forces that would exploit them.
I was just thinking that, you know, I guess it should be at least pointed out that at the end, and the sci-fi part and the Camille stories, her world changing and shifting does seem to be really centered on communities in post-apocalyptic industrial waste zones who are rebuilding the world. And so I think that she must at least see some form of power being built there, or some potential for that kind of action as like a third path.
Yeah.
It's just that in those stories, which are just kind of sketches, a lot came up for both of us on around, what does that mean? Yeah, but what about the forces that don't want you doing what you're doing? Or how are you going to protect your communities or deal with the fact that there are people benefiting and profiting from the hard times the world is going through. But I just do want to say that she did seem to be pointing to that as a model for power building, even if she doesn't call it that.
Right. Yeah, I don't think it's incompatible, which is why I'm proposing that it could be added on to the book. I don't think that there's a total incompatibility there. And I know I keep bringing up, like, is she saying we shouldn't think like this or something? But I think if she's saying that, it's because she has these certain ideas about ideology, heroic pricktail power. But I think that we can still work to undermine the forces that oppress us and have that in mind in this way that is carrier bag, in a way that Ursula K. Le Guin would approve of, in a way that Donna Haraway is also talking about. This is all reminding me of something that a listener said. This person made the observation that Haraway, and also some of these ecological type thinkers like her, tend to put much more of an emphasis on connections and making connections and attachments, making new connections and multiplying connections than they do on detaching and disconnecting from what we need to disconnect from and from what harms us, right? Because we're not unconnected, right? We are supported by flows. A lot of these flows are wrapped up in capital, are wrapped up in the state. We are connected. We are connected to workforces overseas. If we live in America, we are connected to food that's grown in all different places, California, but in like other countries, all this stuff, right? And that's just some obvious things. And Haraway, in the chapter on tentacular thinking, talks about how the tentacular ones make attachments and detachments, how they connect and they sever. But I think it is true that the book makes more of an emphasis on multiplying connection than on articulating like which connections we're already a part of that we would be better off without.
I think that I do think that her emphasis on connection is strategic in the way that she's identifying a core problem in our culture as the emphasis on the finite individuated self as separate from everyone else, whether that, you can call that the neoliberal subject or you could call it just the individual, whatever. That self as distinct from everyone else and all of other life as a unit is really harmful. And so I think she wants to write stories and theories and frameworks that are countering that by increasing connection. But at the same time, when she does draw attention to negative connections or systems that we're part of we might not want to be, it's more like almost as a point of interest. Like the hormone stories about her dog or about herself, that is kind of tying you into all these unpleasant to think about supply chains that get the hormones to her and to her dog. And so she brings those up, but it's almost just like, this is curious, and let's think about where all our stuff comes from, and we should think about that. But that's it. You don't really get a lot of like, and therefore I'm no longer giving my dog hormones. Or, although you get the idea that she does make a lot of choices in life based on rejecting certain things. Or disconnecting from certain things. Just from the way she talks about her life. But I think that I can't decide if there's just a strategic thing in not naming the systems because she wants to have more people take in her ideas who might be defensive if we start talking about their nice stuff or about the ways that they are complicit in the problems. Because we all are to varying degrees, and so I don't know.
I would add that, just as the new connections and the attachments that we need to make are not necessarily obvious to us now, the same is true for some of the detachments. That it's going to be something that arises from the process. And I think that our reflexive ideas of what detachment looks like need to be questioned. That's a good point. But still, I want to thank that contributor for just bringing up that framework for thinking. Not all entanglements are beneficial.
Right. And actually, some of them are keeping us from moving forward in a way that is... It's keeping us from healing, it's keeping the world from healing, and it's keeping us from... Some of the entanglements are keeping us from creating a world that can hold us all.
Right.
You know?
And some of the entanglements are keeping us from making healthier entanglements.
Right. Absolutely.
Keeping us from moving towards healthier entanglements. So, yeah.
Can I read a quote?
Yes.
Okay, so I've got this from Towards an Anarchist Anthropology by David Graeber.
Great book.
Yeah. So he says, the theory of Exodus proposes that the most effective way of opposing capitalism and the liberal state is not through direct confrontation, but by means of what Paulo Virno has called engaged withdrawal, mass defection by those wishing to create new forms of community. One need only glance at the historical record to confirm that most successful forms of popular resistance have taken precisely this form. They have not involved challenging power head-on. This usually leads to being slaughtered, or if not, turning into some often even uglier variant of the very thing one first challenged. But from one or another strategy of slipping away from its grasp, from flight, desertion, the founding of new communities.
Yeah.
So I think that I see place for both, because I think there's going to have to be some direct challenge too.
Yeah.
Especially as there's likely to be increased repression with resource scarcity rising, and with the movement of populations around the world in response to resource scarcity. There is going to be a need for defense, protecting more vulnerable communities, and also facing power. But in the meantime, I think it's very important that we be building up ways of life where we can create a critical mass of positive entanglements as we disconnect ourselves from the negative entanglements.
Yes, that's great. That's a great quote and a great, I think, way to end it. Maybe.
The whole book?
What do you think?
I don't know. Yeah, it might, maybe for now.
Well, do you have any final thoughts, as we conclude this wrap-up episode?
No, but I'm feeling a little bit of a loss if we're not going to talk about the book anymore, so we might have to figure out something else to talk about soon.
Well, one of our ideas for how to carry this on through the summer has been to discuss short readings that relate to this book and the themes of the book. So, do you want to plan on that?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's plan on that. So, for y'all out there, how should we do this? How will we inform people of a reading? I guess we'll put out a short episode.
About what we're reading.
A short episode. We'll talk about something we're going to read for the next week or something like that. We can also put it out on our Facebook group.
Yeah.
Yeah, we already have a few articles bookmarked that elaborate and intersect with Staying with the Trouble. So we'll have sporadic episodes throughout the summer.
And then maybe in the fall we'll read a whole book again?
And then in the fall we'll come back and do another book. Yeah, so thanks for being with us as we discussed piece by piece every little part of Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble. It's been really fun, and this experience has been really generative for us, and hopefully for you too. And so stay subscribed, please, and we will keep this going. We are going to keep this going.
We'll be in touch.
All right, bye-bye.